Grüß, willkommen in einem anderen Aufregens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 33 of my game system design series. In this case I'll be investigating combat systems for figure gaming rules and to a lesser extent board gaming rules as a side issue or comparison. When I originally created this video, it was primarily focused on World War II, Cold War and modern figure gaming. However, in this updated version of the video, I'll be analysing combat systems of all periods and all scales, but with the objective of identifying optimal combat systems based on the objectives the game designers have set. After converting a number of board games into a hexless figure gaming format, one thing which really struck me was the difference in combat systems between most board games and most figure gaming rules. A lot of these differences are due to scale, but even so, designers of figure gaming rules have an approach or approach this topic very differently from board game designers. We'll be discussing some of these differences later in this video, but let's start at the high-level combat system grouping. We can group combat systems into the following two categories. A single stage system, where you spin a dice and determine the final result. A single stage, basically. Or a multi-stage. Spin a dice, determine casualties, which is then possibly used to determine a result. There can be other iterations here, but basically what we are dealing with is a multi-stage system, typically 2 stages. A simple example of a single-stage system is the classic odds-based combat system used in many board games. The attacker totals attack strength, compares this to the defenders as an odds, spin a dice and gets a final result, which could be, let's say, DR, AR, EX, DE, AE, or other related results. Later game systems just provided a number allowing the owner to determine if units should die or retreat. The entire combat is determined based on the result of a single die roll. The multi-stage system has a number of elements which individually attack a target to first inflict losses. Once all losses are inflicted, the number of losses then determine if the target is additionally affected, such as disordered or forced to retreat, or forced to conduct some sort of morale die roll which could result in a morale disorder or other result. A multi-stage, and this is a very simple example of one. While I have to admit I'm fundamentally a board gamer, when I play figure gaming, I always flip into figure game mode and expect the combat system to be the latter multi-stage system, where casualties are inflicted and there's a second step which determines the result, which is basically the multi-stage combat system. When I converted a number of board games into a figure gaming format, I experienced implementing the former system, that's a single stage, with figure gaming. And while much simpler and with a less historical feel or less figure game feel, it does give me the result I need in a simple manner. And when you come down to the final result, it tends to result in a similar outcome. This had me wondering, why is there such a difference between board gaming and figure gaming? Starting with a multi-stage system, historically it's simple to see where the inflict casualties and then determine the combat result system comes from for figure gaming. Possibly the earliest figure gaming would be World War II or Napoleonics at a very low scale. Thus the idea of a soldier firing a rifle or a tank firing a round at a target to inflict casualties is natural. Once a hit is inflicted, there is normally a second step to determine what other effects there are, or what does this actually mean. When we flip back to the single stage, common in board gaming, I'm uncertain why board gaming uses the single stage determine odds, spin a dice and get a final result system. But at a very high scale, this probably does seem the most natural system to use. When each counter represents a core, there is no effective range. You simply compare your core or corpse against the defender and resolve combat in a very abstract manner. Let's drill down into these different combat systems in more detail, starting with a classic odds combat system common in board gaming. In this case, we have 6 combat strengths or strength points attacking 1 combat strength point. The value represents attack, defense, movement. This gives us an odds of 6 to 1, which is a very high odds attack. This shows a typical classic board game CRT. As we can see, 6 to 1, at 6 to 1, the defender has a poor chance of surviving. The results are DE, or defender eliminated. In this case, the defender is totally removed. The next result is DR, which is defender retreats. Finally, we see an exchange, or EX, where the attacker is eliminated, or the defender is eliminated, but the attacker has to lose strength points equal to the defender. We can see that this simple calculation and spin of a d6 will give us a complete and final result. For those interested, this CRT was designed for a series of Napoleonic board games, the SPI Napoleon at War game system to be specific. The other variation of this theme is a differential system where the defender's value is subtracted from the attacker's value. This is actually the system used with the units that you are seeing here. In this case, the differential is +5. The result, or the row, is +5, and the possible outcomes are as follow. D4, which means the defender retreats 4 hexes, or base widths in a figure gaming format, depending if used with or without hexes. D2 means the defender retreats 2 hexes, or base widths. AX means attacker exchange, which means the defender retreats 1 hex, or base width, and the attacker loses units equal in strength to the defender. EX is exchange, which we've already covered. BR means both retreat, both attacker and defender retreats 1 hex, or base width. Once again, we still retain the system of calculate, spin a d6, and obtain a final result. This CRT was designed for Cold War, World War II and modern conflicts and comes from the SPI Modern Battles game system. SPI also has a CRT specifically designed for Ancient. The SPI solution for Ancient battles uses a odds-based CRT tailored to fit that particular game system. This comes from the SPI Pre-Stags board game system. Let's now flip over to the multi-stage system. And let's drill down into the other stage or system, which is more common in figure gaming. In this system, we inflict losses, and based on the losses, other results may occur, such as disorder, disruption, rout, and so on. Now, Core Commander, which is a figure gaming set of rules, but based on a board game, when you really drill down to it, uses a classic figure gaming system, but somehow twists it into a board game type format. So let's look at this because it is the most unusual. So looking at Core Command, the primary fire combat CRT provides you with the losses. In some minor cases, a disperse will also occur. That's the D symbol that we have here, but generally they represent losses. So this fits in with our multi-stage system. Once losses are determined, this can cause a morale test. Thus, if an element suffers 2 SP losses in a single attack, or 4 strength point losses in one phase, it must take some form of test. The test can cause the element to rout. While we can see, here that the casualties do not resolve the combat, unless the element was reduced to 0 SP, which is extremely rare. Instead, the actual combat resolution requires a second step. There are variations on the theme. For DBN, both sides spin a dice to determine who wins and loses the combat. Once this is determined, you go down to this table to determine the result. While this is also a 2-step process, there is no die roll in the second step, simply a checklist to determine what physically occurs. Rules such as LWRS inflict hits, with the possibility of a save for each hit. A unit which suffers 2 hits becomes disordered, and a second disorder results in a retreat, or rout. This is a bucket of dice systems, but is another example of a variation of this theme. The combat consists of the attackers throwing a dice, the defender then throws a save dice. This duplicates a single CRT, which uses a single die roll, but which by itself does not give you a final result. You do need to count the hits. You then count the hits to determine if a unit is disordered, and disordered 2, the unit retreats. Or 2 disorders, the unit retreats. If we go back to a very old set of rules, the WRG, Wargamers Rules for Armoured Warfare, 1925 to 1950, you first determine if you hit a target, then go through a second process to determine what the effect is. Basically, do you penetrate and do damage? This is another example of a 2-stage process. There are many different variations on this theme. However, there is always a common element. That is, there is always at least 2 or more steps to determine the final result of combat. I'm uncertain why this is the case, but I suspect it's due to figure gaming starting with the concept of firing a weapon to see if you hit, and then determining the effect of the hit. In simple terms, the combat system is attempting to be deterministic, with each logical step being simulated and many paths to different results. When developing rules for something unfamiliar, the tendency is to start at the bottom, or the actual deterministic result, and work your way backwards or up. This naturally results in a multi-stage combat system. Let's now determine the benefits and disadvantages of each system. If we start with the one-step system, the answer is the benefit is it's simple and quick, and but the results are abstracted. There is also some issues with a simple single-stage approach, particularly for figure gaming when ranged fire is possible. Do you select all the firers, total them and use that as your calculation? This would work, but can result in some rather strange effects, with a player desperately sending all the fire into a single critical target, while the firers ignore the enemy in front of them. You can resolve this with fire priority rules, and this system will work, but this is something that may seem a bit strange to most figure gamers, although some figure gaming game systems do use something like this, or at least a variation, and I have to admit even in a figure game system with two-stage approach, you do actually also have a ranged fire or issue where all fire is targeting one target, and you may need a fire priority rule even there, but it's more exacerbated in a single-stage system. However, the real issue with a single-stage approach is you need to understand what the real-life effects will be, the outcome of the combat, and use that in your abstracted CRT. This is where the 3-to-1 rule comes from. SPI and other board gamers had the benefit of a large body of US research papers, which included trying to understand what happened in combat during World War II. The Americans are good at collecting data and using logical processes to try and work out what it means, and the guys at SPI probably used a lot of this information. The result is SPI in particular used many of these US-derived conclusions. This is an example of one, FM 105-5 Maneuver Control, which contains a lot of interesting, juicy knowledge or information about fire and close combat during World War II and the modern periods. However, we can go backwards and forwards, benefits and disadvantages, but the primary issue with the single-stage approach is that it is a black box, based on research you may not have available in the rules. You have to trust the CRT is correct, and if designing a game, you need to research and create your own black box, which actually takes a lot of effort. For figure gamers, you can see when a round hits armor, you can logically determine if a 14.5mm bullet can penetrate the frontal armor of a Panther or not. The downside is, of course, that you can get caught up in the weeds very easily when you go down this latter approach. As a result, in the multi-stage combat system, you get a more deterministic solution. Thus, you have the feeling you are dealing with a higher level of realism. The downside is it's inherently a more complex system, or more physically demanding system. Effort has to be made to reduce the complexity by using a bucket of dice with a simple value you need to exceed to achieve something. This does make it simpler, but could be considered more physically demanding. Is any of these systems better than the other? Personally, I feel the system used is dependent on what you're trying to achieve. However, at a simple level, the optimal system can depend on the way combat is conducted in your set of rules or in a game. For example, in LWRS, you will typically pick one spot and focus your attack against it. Thus, along the whole front line, you may find only one point which is involved in intense combat. In most cases, you're attacking a single enemy combat unit or regiment. Thus, there may only, battalion. Thus, there may only be a single combat in a player turn. The number of combats are, as a result, very low. Thus, spinning a bucket of dice per combat is not a major issue. On the other hand, using the SPI Napoleon War board game, or figure game conversion of that, combat is often across the whole front line. The game system encourages this so you can lock down the enemy unit's front line and restrict their forces' ability to move. This results in a large number of combat. In Wagram, the French will typically launch 6 attacks per player turn and the Austrians as well. At a dozen combats per game turn, you need a simpler system per combat. This does raise an interesting logistic issue. If you have a game which lasts for 12 game turns and you want the game to complete in 3 hours, then each game turn should take about 15 minutes. Even if you assume the first 2 game turns do not involve much combat and can be executed in much less time, you have to contend with unusual increases in the time needed to complete other combats or other game turns because of intensity of fighting. This gives you 7.5 minutes per player. There is only so much you can do in a 7.5 minute period. I'm not going to deal with the time required for moving your elements, but even if that was trivial, you need to conduct your combats on average within a 5-minute period. Thus, you now need to consider how long does it take to conduct a single combat. Time to calculate, time to reference the CRT, time to spin the die, and time to conduct the combat results. In Napoleon at War, combat intensity ranges from 2 to 6 combats per player per game turn. Even if we assume a low average of 4, that is 8 combats which need to be conducted in 10 minutes. In Napoleon at War, this is easy, especially when you have memorized the main combat results table, which is comparatively easy to do. Calculating odds is also very simple, as you are normally dealing with a defensive strength of, let's say, only 2s or 3s, and odds of typically around 2 to 1, 3 to 1. The die roll is quick, and in most cases you know what the result is. But even if not, referencing the CRT is a very quick process. The results are simple as well: removal of elements or the retreat of a unit 1 base width, if you're using the figure game conversion of this. DBN, in theory, is simple as well, once you've memorized all the result combinations. LWRS is in theory also simple, but each single combat can involve a large number of elements, and the charts needed to cross-reference to determine how many fire points you have is reasonably significant. This is not hard, but if you had to conduct 4 combats per player turn, it would start to really take a lot of time. As it is, the combats are normally restricted to 1 or 2 complex combats per game turn, and a larger number of simple combats which only require 1 or 2 dice, or the results are pretty obvious. Thus, in conclusion, a complex combat system, such as a multi-stage combat system, is viable if the number of combats per game turn, or player turn, is kept low. If the number of combats is much larger, the single-stage combat system is optimal. This now raises another interesting aspect or point. The reason why multi-stage combat systems are better is that they can reduce the impact of luck compared with a single-stage system. However, if you're having more combats using a single-stage system, the luck does average out, and as a result there's no real difference in terms of luck between the two systems. The other advantage with a multi-stage system is that you are deterministically determining combat, with each step being testable and transparent. However, if the single-stage system is using a body of research to arrive at an accurate result, it could be argued the latter is superior. It's just that you don't understand it at the moment of play. Where a deterministic system really shines is when modelling an unknown, as there is no research to use to create your black box, such as modern conflicts or Cold War, or even better, science fiction conflicts. Now let's factor in the fun factor, because that is often ignored by the designers until it's too late. What do players actually enjoy? In simple terms, players enjoy whatever they can control. Thus, movement is enjoyable, setting up combat is enjoyable. In the most cases, executing the combat is just a mechanical task, although the spinning of dice can be a bit exciting. Spinning a lot of dice can even be more exciting, which is why the bucket of dice system can be quite popular. It's also popular as it avoids the use of a CRT. Any calculation, maths, or cross-referencing a CRT is never enjoyable, and if you're forced to do it a lot, it can be quite exhausting. Nonetheless, the single-stage combat system has the higher probability of being enjoyable, or at least not being as not enjoyable. However, if well designed, a multi-stage system can also be more enjoyable than boring. It's all about the way you design the system, CRT, or the number of dice you spin, and the system around that multi-dice spinning process. This is a subjective opinion of myself, but I like the bucket of dice system used in LWRS, as the spinning of 12 to 4 dice can be rather exciting. However, there is a limit to this, and if done too many times, this becomes a chore. I also enjoy the complexity of determining combat order, forcing enemy units to retreat in order to surprise an enemy unit and destroy it, or surround an enemy unit and destroy it, as occurs in the Napoleonic War system. DBMM does this as well, and this level of nuanced detail can be very exciting to gamers. Empire 3rd Edition took this to a new level where each side had to arrange their corps in a specific order to achieve a specific task, and then the combat almost became a mini-game or mini-mind puzzle. Empire 3rd Edition was too complex, but the basic premise is very interesting and should, in theory, work. Surprisingly, Corps Commander also achieved this, although the rules were so complex that players would rarely possess enough elements to make this kind of nuanced activity ever occur. The quick play version of Corps Commander, which I attempted to create, does show this more clearly, but even there it's too complex to really achieve what you wanted, that is, the movement of elements and determining combat order. That's exciting, but if the effort to get to that point is so great you're mentally exhausted, it kind of negates it a bit. And unfortunately that's the case with Corps Commander. The idea of having a mini-game within the main game does have its attractions. The game becomes a game of, manoeuvring between the players, and then one player is ready to attack, the prearranged formation would engage. Players would determine combat order in order to achieve advantages in subsequent combat rounds. This does have a lot of appeal, especially for Napoleonics. However, we still have our basic issue, time and effort. In this example, a game would consist of manoeuvring, one mass combat, which would take up most of the game, and then a mopping up if successful or reforming the line if not. That actually would work, but that's the kind of system that you're really looking for if you're going to go down this particular approach. However, much as I like all these other systems, I found I really like the single-stage board gaming combat system probably better for a game. It seems to allow me to reproduce historical conflicts in a more satisfying manner while keeping the game length down. I can't help but feel there is no really single best system. It all depends on other external factors. But saying that, I do really like the Empire 3rd Edition, and I did create a set of Napoleonic rules which attempts to achieve this, and it uses a traditional figure gaming two-stage approach for combat, and it seems to work. But it is a lot more complex than, let's say, the SPI Napoleonic War figure game conversion. And so we come to an end of episode 33, my video series on game design theory, in this case discussing combat systems. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.